Welcome, everyone, to the third edition of Big Blue Banter, a relatively new Giants podcast that aims to dive into the X's and O's. That's what I love. That's what my co-host Nick Turchyn loves to do. And we're going to take an analytical look from a game tape standpoint, Nick's specialty, and at every single player on the Giants roster. We're not just talking the starters. We're not just talking Odell Beckham Jr. and Saquon Barkley. Our goal is to break down everyone. And today I'm excited because this is our training camp preview. We're going to feature three of my favorite position battles heading into training camp. Three battles I think will shape this Giants 2018 season. We're going to dive into another Pat Shurmur offensive concept. We're going to talk Janoris Jenkins and what went down yesterday, everything I know now because it's the elephant in the room. And of course, we're going to touch a little bit on the Odell Beckham Jr. potential for a holdout. This is Big Blue Banter. Let's get this rolling. I'm going to throw it now to Nick. How's it going, Nick?
Pretty good. Alive and good as always.
That's always good to be alive at this time of the year, especially.
Yeah, very slow in June. Twitter is dead, if you haven't noticed. It's like unbelievably quiet out there.
It is unbelievably quiet out there right now. This is the time of the year where fans are even taking a break from the NFL, the only time of the year. But we're still here because we know training camp is on the way, and we want to give you a preview of that. So we're going to jump right in, but first, of course, we have to start with the news, the elephant in the room, the Janoris Jenkins situation. So yesterday at about 5 p.m., it was revealed that police in the Fair Lawn area of New Jersey discovered a dead body in the home of Janoris Jenkins. However, Janoris Jenkins was not in the state at the time. He has not been in the state since the end of June minicamp on the 15th. He has two houses. His other home is in Florida, where he's originally from. He was there. Hasn't been home in a while. So as of now, he's not a suspect at all. He's not a person of interest. However, the body found was a friend of Janoris Jenkins and of his family. Janoris Jenkins' family had been living in his Fair Lawn house when he was away. Not positive if they were also living there when he was, when he's in town, when he's playing for the Giants, when he's in New Jersey. But the most recent update we do have on this is that the police have now identified Janoris' brother, William, a 34-year-old man, as a person of interest in this case, not a suspect, but a person of interest. Janoris has reportedly, at least according to Josina Anderson of ESPN, feels okay with the situation. He is not, like I said, a person of interest at all, not a suspect. The Giants and his lawyers had advised him just stay in Florida. He obviously was not around for whatever went down, and those are the details we have now on the situation. It's a terrible tragedy. I do not want to, speculate on anything here. I do not really want to make any opinions about the situation because remember, in the end, this is a case of a man who passed away, a young man who passed away in the home of Janoris Jenkins. But for now, I would not worry about this too much if I was Giants fans. I would wait for the details to come out. We did see a video of Janoris' neighbor in Fair Lawn, and she I'm blanking on her name right now, but she basically said Janoris has been a perfect neighbor since moving in, really polite, really helpful in the community, in the neighborhood. So as of now, I don't think there's anything to worry about. Nick, did you want to add anything on that, or can we jump right into the good stuff?
I think we can jump into the good stuff. I mean, this just touches a little bit on the depth of the secondary, but again, we'll get into that later. And there is no issues on the depth now as in regards to Janoris. It's just more about longer term. Like, we have two very good cornerbacks now, but behind that is a question mark.
Right. And I did an article today, actually, that I made the point that the headline of the article is cornerback is a position that could be the Giants' fatal flaw in 2018. And I'm not going to dive into too much of that at this time. You can check it out on Giants and 247sports.com. It really dives into what I really started to think about once this Janoris Jenkins, incident came out. And I wondered, hey, what can the Giants compete if Jenkins is in fact suspended? And the answer is no. Even if Jenkins is going to play, and we'll dive into this another time. But even if Jenkins is going to play, there's two key issues to worry about with this Giants cornerback position. And those issues are, in fact, one, the depth of the cornerback position, because behind Janoris Jenkins and Eli Apple, the Giants are lacking depth. There's no doubt about it. And then the other thing to worry about is the nickel cornerback position, which we'll touch on another time, currently occupied by William Gay. But for now, we're going to dive into another position in the secondary, and that's the deep safety role, something a lot of people are worried about, and for good reason. And I want to throw it to Nick and ask if Darian Thompson can potentially emerge as a post-type sleeper. Thompson entering year 3, former third-round pick, was a ball hawk at Boise State, Injuries have limited him until this point in his career. What are your thoughts? Can he be a post-hype sleeper?
Yeah, I did a fair amount of work of Darian Thompson, and actually have a piece that's going to hit in pretty soon, I guess is the way to say it, over at something I'll talk about later at the end of the podcast for where I was recently brought on. But anyway, real quick on the breakdown on Darian, very good getting downhill against short passes and intermediate routes. Can take really good angles. Is not a real thumper, but generally a good fundamental tackler. If he doesn't get the hip or the thigh, he's going to get the legs. Against the run, he plays with great closure to the ball carrier. In that 5 to 10 yard space, he doesn't hesitate most of the time and has good football intelligence. He actually had a 29 on the Wonderlic too. Did you know that? He's a pretty smart guy. So in terms of recognition, he's seeing some good things there. As a blitzer, I like him as a blitzer. And from around the line of scrimmage, he closes in pretty nicely on the quarterback and has the ability to shed blockers blockers on the way to the quarterback. So really featured a lot of that through 2 games in 2016 before his injury. It ended up being a Lisfranc injury after 2 to 3 weeks, I believe, on the bench as he was kind of nursing his foot. So anyway, the reason why I'm jumping into this is that's most of what he can do. If you notice, that's not many deep safety traits. He certainly was a ball hawk in college with 19 interceptions. I will say though too, he did have, I think it was 10. It was a high number of touchdowns given up when as deep safety too as well. So his issues though, what he kind of struggles with is he doesn't have a great initial burst. Many guys want to look at his 40 time and criticize that. I would more look at his play speed. His play speed is not tremendous. It's kind of average. And that's fine if you have good mental processing to stay ahead of things. It's when he doesn't, and when guys get behind him or press him vertically, that he kind of can get into a difficult position. And I think Giants fans are going to know that through watching the film through 2017, that there are, a fair amount of examples here. He looks a little lost in coverage at times. I have a few notes here about, he opens to the wrong side, just really kind of almost like rookie mistakes and rookie fundamentals that he's still working through. And I think that's a big part of where he is in the process now is still a work in process to get there. I do think though, in terms of a fit, I think that he will. I think that he's going to play a lot because for him around the line of scrimmage and for him in kind of out of a 2 deep look where he's basically a middle range safety or a robber safety, whether it be cover 3 in a buzz role as a buzzing safety or cover 1 robber role where he's kind of moved up. I think that's a real good spot for him because of his high kind of football intelligence. But something in terms of patrolling the deep safety right now, it's still a work in progress.
Yeah, Nick, and you mentioned a lot of good things I want to dive into there. And we start with what you said about, he was still making a lot of rookie mistakes last season. What fans have to remember is that he was essentially a rookie last year. You mentioned that he suffered the Lisfranc injury. He only played 2 games with the Giants, played 2.5 games with the Giants, I believe, or 1.5. I'm sorry. He played half of that Dallas Cowboys game in week 1 of his rookie season, then the entire Saints game. And then he tried to nurse it through all the way through the Giants bye week. And then they kind of gave up on him. A Lisfranc is a super tricky injury. It can return at any time. You have to have kind of a mental confidence to get over it in future games and future seasons. And it's possible that Thompson is still kind of learning the tricks of the trade at the safety position in the NFL. So that's something I want to look forward to as a potential for, maybe the light will turn on. But again, we're talking about a guy who missed all of minicamp this past month with another injury. Now, Thompson is expected to return for training camp. There isn't really much information on his injury right now. But again, he missed more time. And these are valuable reps that somebody like him, who you mentioned, is making a lot of rookie mistakes, needs to have. And then you talk about kind of how he might be best in a robber role. It makes a lot of sense. He made a lot of plays around the line of scrimmage during the games he has played. But the issue for the Giants is this. Listen, do they need another robber type safety with Landon Collins in the mix and with a player like Curtis Riley really, really stepping up in minicamp? And we'll touch on Riley in a little bit. But do they need another robber type safety? I'm not so sure. I mean, we know this is a team that wants to use a lot more single high safety this year, that wants to use Landon Collins as more of a roaming chess piece, and they need a complement for him. Now, I will say this when it comes to Thompson. I actually am a little more optimistic than you are as far as it goes for Thompson in a deep safety role. I think back to that Saints game from week 2 of the 2016 season. That was a game where Drew Brees and the Saints, and this is before they had Alvin Kamara, this is when they were more of a vertically attacking team, failed to complete a single pass of 25 plus yards in September. Nice weather in MetLife. Can't blame it on that. The Giants defense limited to Brees to just 6 yards per passing attempt, which is an accomplishment for any defense. But Thompson played a big role in that as the deep safety in that game, in a game where the Giants really didn't generate that much pressure from their pass rush. So that's something that always stuck out to me. And then also in week 1 of his rookie season, I'll never forget the time when he really came down. And like you said, this is when he was playing more of an interchangeable role, came down from one of the safety spots, came across the line of scrimmage and stopped Ezekiel Elliott on a draw play for a negative, it was for a 0-yard gain. And this was a play where it really stood out to me. I haven't seen too many safeties have that kind of, break on the ball that Thompson had. And again, like we said, Landon Collins is the type of player who can drop in deep coverage. You would agree with that, correct, Nick?
Yeah, no, that it was something that as I was watching the Giants last year, we do have to remember, obviously, they're mostly too deep. But in the rotations, when they would roll to either cover 3 or some other type of rotation, oftentimes Collins was taking the deep safety role. So he definitely has that. I do think that it's not really his go-to place, but it's definitely something where he functioned there well. And the one thing I would say about Betcher, I'm still trying to dig up the statistics here, but he plays too deep a little bit more than people realize. And it's not a traditional too deep where where both safeties have the same depth. Right. Oftentimes he actually liked to move. I think it was Tyron. I forget the safety's name in Arizona. He played kind of a short safety on the weak side, and so it's interesting. I think that Betcher likes to rotate a lot of defensive backs. That's definitely the case. And I think that they're going to try to find as many of those as they can, and that's why I think that Thompson will definitely be in the mix, at least, if not the starter, just because he has enough leadership as well as enough good traits getting downhill that it's totally worth it for him to still be around.
Right. And you make a great point there, Nick, because we don't have to look at this as a black and white. There will be two starters, Landon Collins and X. What we can look at this like is everything we've known from James Betcher's defense. You made a great point because we talk a lot of single high safety on this podcast, and I talk about it a lot on Twitter, but it's not exclusive single high safety. No defensive coordinator uses that exclusively, obviously. That would be way too easy to game plan against and exploit. But what he could do, James Betcher, and what he's done in the past with Arizona is a heavy rotation all across his defense. And that's exactly what we saw during spring OTA practices and minicamp. He mixed in 4 different players at the safety position with Landon Collins and Darian Thompson sideline. We're talking about Andrew Adams, who's, arguably the Giants' best coverage safety, although I think he has issues tackling at the final level, something I also have issues with Darian Thompson we'll get. But that's another story. Mixing in Michael Thomas, the free agent addition from the Miami Dolphins, who followed defensive backs coach Lou I'm pronouncing this guy's name wrong. Lou Anarumo, I think it is, but I'll have to double check that at another time. But who's now the Giants defensive backs coach, Thomas followed him, and he may have an upper leg in that competition just because the coach may see something that he liked that the Dolphins didn't fully utilize, because again, Thomas was mostly a special teams ace with the Dolphins. So he's been mixing in with the first team unit. They could use him to his strengths. They've also used Curtis Riley, a guy they signed from the Titans. And again, the Giants signed a cornerbacks coach from the Titans, and now Riley followed with him. But Riley actually made the transition last season from cornerback to safety. And during minicamp, he was starting to step into, a first team role at safety. Here's what James Betcher, the defensive coordinator, said about him. And this touches, I'm going to tell this quote only because this touches on what you just mentioned, Nick, how the Giants may actually use a rotation at safety that tries to fit the safeties into the roles that fit their strengths. So Curtis is a guy, this is what Betcher said. Curtis is a guy, we all know he's played corner, so he's got really great feet and hips and range. And the thing I'm probably most proud of him about is how he's picked it up playing safety, because that's a change. You go from playing outside and you go to inside. So he's already talking about going to inside, so more of a nickelback slot role. And some of the checks and the communications, in 1 minute you're in the post, the next minute you're down, or playing in the half field, or you're blitzing off the edge. And some of the duties that our safeties have to handle here, like those specifically, he's done a really nice job with that. So I'm excited for him. Getting to training camp, and he's competing to work with that first team unit and grow over these last 2 months. So again, the thing I take away from that mostly is that he's been using Riley in a specific role. And that's something we talked about all offseason, Nick, with this new change in the coaching staff from guys like Steve Spagnuolo and Ben McAdoo to Pat Shurmur and James Bettcher, coaches who, instead of trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, these are coaches who look at the talent that they have on the roster and then try to fit their scheme around it. So I think that's what we're going to see at that safety position. And that should be really interesting. And I think both me and Nick, if we had to make a prediction now, would agree that it will be a rotation at the safety position next to Collins. Is that where you stand, Nick?
Yeah, I think that Thomas may emerge as a real kind of slot hybrid. And I think they're gonna run a fair amount of big nickel actually. So with 3 safeties in nickel instead of a true nickel back. And I think that's going to be a good shakeup for them with the talent that they have, like you said, with the talent that they're dealing with right now.
Yeah, of course. And they're not, we always knew this is a team that had 3 wins last season. They were never going to be able to fix every single hole in one offseason, but they don't have to. I mean, we have teams that, go on runs in the NFL that have glaring weaknesses. The Jaguars had glaring weaknesses last season, but still made a run because they were really, really good at what they did, at the few things they did. So we're going to actually shift over now to another training camp battle I'm super excited about. And that's for this number 3 wide receiver role. And right now, the front runners are Cody Latimer, the free agent acquisition from the Denver Broncos, a guy who was a former second-round pick, and Hunter Sharp, another former Broncos player the Giants actually had last season and actually started in Week 17 for the Giants in their win over the Washington Redskins. I'm going to throw it to you, Nick, first. What have you seen from these players? And I'll talk a little bit about what I saw from them in spring OTAs and minicamp.
Sure. Starting off with Cody Latimer, bigger guy. 6'2", 215 pounds out of Indiana back in 2014. He was drafted in the 2nd round. So like you said, came out of college with good size and strength, did 23 reps of bench at the combine. He's a guy with very good athletic ability, very good at making. In fact, I think he really enjoys making acrobatic catches with high pointing balls, even if they don't need to be high pointed. He loves to compete for contested balls. He played a fair amount. I think it was a lot of special teams at Denver, where he was basically behind the depth chart between their very strong wide receivers, years 2015 through 17. And won a Super Bowl in 15. So is a guy who understands what it takes to win in terms of a team. He's a very solid blocker. I would be a little careful with him around the line of scrimmage. I think he needs a little help in terms of technique. I think a few guys in the Giants need a little help in terms of their technique to be consistent. But, as a guy who's 6'2", 215, he certainly does not shy away from contact. He played a fair amount of the slot, out of the slot in Denver, which I thought was kind of interesting for someone his size. Traditionally now with college players or with college teams using the speed guy, the speed demon in the slot to create mismatches. Here, he's almost like a throwback to that old slot receiver who's bigger and can help provide mismatches on smaller nickelbacks. And guys like Matt Waldman, compared him to a slower Keenan Allen. I don't know if I really agree with that. I kind of more like Kenny Britt, but not as flashy. And the big question I think people would have up to this point is like, Nick, you've complimented pretty good. What was the deal if he played with Peyton Manning? How come he kind of, was not, he didn't have a big role in that team? And I think really looking at the film or the lack of film for when Peyton Manning was there, he had some issues with basically Manning's game plan and Manning's execution. When you say issues, Manning, I don't know if people understand or get that kind of Manning didn't run a ton of plays. It wasn't like he had a massively expansive playbook. Peyton Manning was his whole the difficult part with playing wide receiver for him are the level of checks and audibles that had to go on at the line of scrimmage. And number one, following them alone, I think is pretty difficult. Number two, executing them within different sight reads, depending on what the defense does in the middle of your route, is what is massively crucial in Peyton's offense. And quite frankly, that's kind of where he lacked. And so does this say that he, his mental processing is issues? Where does the issue lie? If it's or where does this come from? I'm not really sure. The bottom line is too, I think that, we all remember tape of Peyton being pretty demanding in terms of kind of, staring guys down after missing or making a poor read. So I think for a rookie, he kind of, or a younger player developing, he kind of, got a little frustrated. He did have an incident. I forget if it was something involving some run-in with the police too as well. So this is he's a little bit of a project almost, but he's someone who last year really showed in the back half of the season. He really flashed to me as a guy who wanted it, as a guy who was willing to kind of do anything to catch balls, and understanding that, he was kind of at a point in his career where he really needed to do that to further it. To be frank, I think, at least reading the kind of Denver beat writers, if he didn't play special teams, I'm not sure if he still would have really been on that team last year. So for me, it's something I'm really interested to see how he develops with the Giants. I think that as a third wide receiver, it's something that Shurmur didn't really have last year as well. He had two really good wide receivers at 1 and 2, but there was a good amount of drop off to Jarius Wright. So I think he could be better than Wright, and I think it's going to be interesting how they feature him. I think he could play lone X wide receiver on the weak side of the offense.
Yeah, and before we jump into Hunter Sharp, because we'll also definitely dive into him, I wanted to touch a little bit on Latimer, and I'll be the first to say it right now, and you guys can hold me to this. I think it's going to be his job, and he's going to run away with this, in my opinion. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Why I have him over Hunter Sharp and Roger Lewis and guys like that, but what I've seen from Latimer is this. Here's a guy who admittedly said, I was not a pro when I entered the NFL. And it makes sense because he really rose fast at Indiana. That's where he played in the Big Ten at Indiana. That's where he plays college football. He rose fast. He was not a big-time player at Indiana. They didn't pass the ball very often there, and they didn't do it successfully when they did. That was a really ugly offensive scheme to watch. When people talk about the Big Ten being one of the most boring conferences, and listen, I'm a Wisconsin graduate. I watch Big Ten 24/7. I get it. They need to reference that Indiana offense from the years where Latimer played, but he came on fast because of some of what he flashed on the field. I really like the Kenny Britt comparison. I had no NFL comp for him, but I've watched him obviously, and especially before this podcast, I took a look at some games from his last season, and I like that. I see that Kenny Britt comparison. But here's a guy, like I said, who admitted I wasn't ready to be a pro. He said that after signing with the Giants. I didn't apply everything I need to. From a work ethic standpoint, from a preparation standpoint, from film work standpoint as a wide receiver to my game until last season. And then last season with the Broncos, the first season where he had any decent amount of snaps, he played 380 snaps, a career high on offense in 2017. Before that, he had a season of 37 snaps as a rookie, no more than 250 any other season. And during this 2017 season with an extended run, he set career highs in his catch rate, 70.4% of balls thrown his way, of catchable balls thrown his way, and yards per reception, 15.1 yards per reception. These are numbers according to Pro Football Focus. So we're talking about a guy who put it all together last season. He still wasn't very featured in an offense that, didn't move the ball through the air with with Trevor Siemian and the mess of a Broncos offensive line, and behind, obviously, still Emmanuel Sanders and Demaryius Thomas. But, here's a guy who was expected to come in as a rookie with Peyton Manning, like you say, and play in an offense that has wide receiver option routes, similar to what Kevin Gilbride, I assume, ran back in the day with the Giants, where, it can work if you're on the same page with the quarterback, but it's hard to get on the same page with the quarterback if your work ethic isn't impeccable from day one because you're working with Peyton Manning. So I think that Lattimore is a guy who will win this job on the outside because what he's going to be able to do in that role you just talked about, that lone X role, is block on the outside. He hasn't been an elite blocker, but he has earned above average blocking grades throughout his career, according to Pro Football Focus. He has the size to do it on the outside. And then finally, in minicamp, in that 3-day minicamp, he actually had 3 touchdown receptions from Eli Manning, and they were all kind of red zone drills where he kind of showed off that 39-inch vertical leap. Here's a guy who's going to see single coverage the entire year. I don't expect him to be a focal point of this passing game. I don't expect him to have a big role in the passing game, but I expect him to make plays when football comes his way. And do you have any reason, Nick, to believe that I could be wrong about this and that Hunter Sharp, for example, or maybe even Roger Lewis or somebody from the free agent market can surpass him?
I think it's tough. Hunter Sharp, you're talking about a guy who's 5'11", 198, was on the same Denver team. He was undrafted, in 2016. So, not for the same amount of time. He's more of a deep threat type. A guy ran a 4.51 on the 40, quick. He's very quick off the line, good initial burst. Outside of that, it's not meaning to criticize him because I think his speed is definitely very strong, and he's a punt returner, which again, there is a bit of a theme with this Giants team with their free agents that they're bringing in, these guys can all play special teams, and I absolutely love that. But getting back to Hunter Sharp for a second, same type of guy. He's a good blocker, not a great blocker, but his size to me is an issue. Not just the 5'11", 198, but the way he plays within that. His frame is fine, but it's just he's not an overly physical guy, and both physical corners can kind of take him, and I think defenders coming downhill can take him. And the other side of this is what where he struggled a bit. It's almost a little bit like Russell Shepard,
Right.
in terms of being a smaller guy that in traffic, his hands are not unbelievable. And a guy like that needs to catch the ball. And so what you saw with the Denver film from last year, where he did play a fair amount last year, just some drops that you want to see completed, tough catches that you want him to be your guy. And so for me, Hunter Sharp, I'm looking at maybe a wide receiver 5, wide receiver 4, kind of best case, with Shepard ahead of him at this point. And again, and again, Camp can. And I best way to say it, I guess both Shepards ahead of him, right? Yeah. And Camp, with Camp, obviously a lot of things can change, but I think that's going to be a tough spot for him to crack.
No doubt. And we're talking about a guy, hey, he's making a lot of plays in spring practices, but again, there's no pads on, there's no live contact. And again, he reminds me a lot of Tavares King and the role he's had with the Giants over the past few seasons before obviously signing with the Vikings this offseason. Kind of that deep threat who can take the top off the defense, but that's not as important if they're going to be using, different vertical concepts with Odell Beckham Jr. on the outside and potentially Sterling Shepard on the outside this season. And you look at, like you said, you mentioned it best. Sterling Shepard, 5'10.5". Odell Beckham, 5'11". You want to put a guy like Latimer with those guys. You don't want to put a guy like Russell Shepard on the field too often, or a guy like Hunter Sharp, guys who can't beat the press as well, can't physically block the boundary as well. Right. So I think that I think Latimer definitely has the edge there. And you mentioned an excellent theme, how a lot of these free agent signings have had special teams experience, but also special teams, success. We're talking about Latimer, who last year, Vance Joseph, the head coach of Denver Broncos, said he's my pick for the All-Pro Gunner of the Year. That's how impressed he was. And then obviously Michael Thomas is a guy who, we talked about competing for the safety spot, but he's also won the Special Teams Player of the Year award from Pro Football Focus in 3 of the last 4 seasons. And another interesting theme that I've actually noticed with these signings, actually, hold on, sorry. I just lost my train of thought real quick because I was thinking about Michael Thomas. We'll get back to that because
he has an effect on some people, man. You lose your thought. It's hard, man.
Yeah, exactly.
Like that.
Yeah, totally. What I was going to say is another interesting theme with a lot of these free agent signings is that they came from teams where the coach is now on the Giants. So, for example, Cody Latimer and Hunter Sharp, they played on the Denver Broncos. Now the Denver Broncos coach then was Tyke Tolbert. Now he's the wide receivers coach of the New York Giants. We're talking about, Curtis Riley, a guy we mentioned before who's really impressed during minicamp, potentially could have a role on defense in the big nickel at safety. He played with the Giants, cornerbacks coach. And then obviously Lou Anarumo, the guy who we mentioned before, a guy whose name I still can't pronounce and may never be able to, saw Michael Thomas up close, mostly in a special teams role with the Dolphins, and said, look, this is a guy who can help your team as a safety. So I really like that, kind of the inside information there. Even Thomas McGahee, their special teams coach, special teams coordinator, brought in Teddy Williams, the cornerback who's been a special teams ace in the past for the Carolina Panthers, and will probably fill a similar role again on the back end of that Giants roster this season. So that's another theme that really intrigued me about this offseason. But for now, we're going to dive into another position battle that's obviously, one of the most publicized for the diehard Giants fans, at least through minicamp, and that's the center position because, it was expected to be a runaway for Brett Jones, a guy who came in for Weston Richburg last season, was one of the best pass blockers in the league, at least according to Pro Football Focus. But now he's actually seeing less reps with the starting lineup than John Halapio, the former 2016 undrafted 6th-round pick of the New England Patriots. So what have you seen from both of those? And again, remember, guys, there's not a lot of game tape on Halapio. There's definitely some game tape on Jones. But what are your thoughts on the center position battle in training camp?
Gotcha. Yeah, I focused a little bit more on Halapio just because he just seemed kind of interesting that he was getting the time. And then there was that great article this past week, which we'll throw in the show notes too, about how Jalapeno and Jones are actually really good friends and pushing each other in this competition, which to me just kind of talks about the new Giants versus the old Giants of last year in terms of a team. Anyway, Jalapeno went to Florida. He's 6'3", 315, so really pretty good size, very good length. I didn't dig up his arm length, but on film, his size is imposing, which is kind of interesting for a guy competing for the center position. That size to me gives him versatility across the rest of the line. He was drafted in the 6th round by the New England Patriots. For me, what I saw is positive. He in gap schemes, he pulls pretty well, has good athleticism against really anyone that the front seven can put on him, in any position for that matter. In my opinion, I think this guy could even play backup tackle basically. So much has been made of outside zone wrinkles this past year. One play where the center and the guard actually lead in the alley, I could see him running in either of those positions. So just real good athleticism. And he's got okay use of hands at the point of attack. He's got some real raw strength to finish blocks, which you kind of want to hone a little bit, I think. He showed a lot of athleticism towards blitzing guys blitzing in the run game, making real good lateral movement side to side and kind of deflecting. And I'm all talking about basically the Washington Redskins game from Week 17. The Redskins front threw some wrinkles at the Giants, and he handled it pretty well. Where he struggles a little bit with reach blocks and zone. His timing and use of hands in zone blocking, it's a little off. It's a little uncoordinated. Has some issues maintaining balance through contact. I think that's a little bit to do with his frame, and more to do with the bigger thing, which to me, which is the biggest issue, was his stance. He didn't really seem to have a ton of bend or great bend in the lower body, and where I saw is, for him to get optimal pad level as a bigger guy against, defenders coming from down low to, be that for low man to win, he ended up lowering his head a lot, and not by a massive amount, but just enough where it led to weaker engagements where you could see his shoulders rolling forward, and he missed some targets in that way, because when you do that, you kind of lose your vision a little bit, it seems. And, I think that's something that O-line coach Hal Hunter is going to have to work on. Coming from as a center, I think that will be a little more negated after snapping the ball. I think that, again, his fundamentals left you home too, because you lost the hand at the get off, since you are snapping. But I do think, projecting for him, I think he can win this battle, and I think it's going to be really close. And I think nonetheless, whether he wins it or not, I think he's the 6th lineman, really, no matter what. I think Greco is very, very good, and as a much different type of player, an older veteran who, both of these guys, Greco and Jalapeno, play. They pull really well. Obviously, the Giants want to run man schemes. These guys fit that, so I like the scheme fit for both, and especially Jalapeno. But I do think that he'll be that 6th man on the line for sure, at least.
Yeah, no doubt. And you talk about what he's able to do from an athletic standpoint. And what really stood out to me with Jalapeno is his story. I mean, this is a guy who obviously was out of the NFL for a little while when the Patriots cut him. And he was working at a car dealership at the time, but was doing 3-hour training sessions before a 9 to 5, and then another training session at night after. This is a guy who never gave up on his dream, and it's finally starting to pay off. We've seen the success that Dave Gettleman, Giants general manager, has had in the past finding offensive linemen, and he could see something that he likes from, like you talk about, an athletic standpoint, the upside standpoint. In the NFL, a lot of these guys end up sticking on rosters and having careers based on the ability to do one thing very well better than others, because the rest they can kind of come around to. Or if you can do that one thing very well better than others, it's enough to help you, you have success at the NFL level. So I'm definitely interested to see that, because it's really a battle that's going to come down to what kind of direction the Giants want this offensive line to go. We know the type of player Brett Jones is. We know the type of player John Jalapeno is. They're very different options at center. And I actually think you're right. He's going to make the roster regardless. Both players will make the roster regardless. But I do think that, personally, I think that there's only one roster spot even open for this offensive line. And we can touch a little bit more on this as we move forward through the offseason. But as of now, I think that both Jalapeno, Jones, and Greco are really locks for this roster. I think what it's going to come down to is that 8th and final offensive line spot is either going to be Chad Wheeler or the former out of USC, obviously, from last offseason, or a guy they signed in camp, a veteran to fill that swing tackle role. But we're going to actually transition now to the last part of today's show, or not the second and last part, I should say. We have one little thing at the end. We're going to transition to breaking down one more concept in Pat Shurmur's offense. And today we're going to look into the mesh concept of Shurmur's offense. So, Nick, I want to hear your breakdown on this. How often is this concept used, and what can we expect going forward in the 2018 season with it?
Yeah, sure. So the mesh concept, one of them, I guess one of my favorites. Hard to say which favorite. They're all great. No play is more representative of the air raid actually than the mesh concept. Most people don't realize that the air raid and West Coast offense both have the same roots in the old BYU offense under Lavelle Edwards. I think it was in the late 40s / early 50s. So anyway, coming out of that, both air raid and West Coast look to get guys in space. It's kind of the goal of the crossing routes and the shorter, shallow routes. And so starting off with mesh, if we can kind of break this down, we're going to envision this out of 11 personnel. So 11 personnel means one running back, one tight end, and then thus 3 wide receivers. The name of the play refers to the 2 wide receivers on opposite sides of the field. It's usually Y and X. So X being the split end, as well as Y, whether it's a tight end or a slot receiver, or it could be 2 slot receivers for that matter. And both of those receivers run shallow crosses in opposite directions. So they basically, if you think about envision that, they would almost be kind of colliding, and that's kind of the goal. The rule is that the Y player, or the player on the strong side, sets the depth of the mesh, and meaning he works to whatever amount of yards he wants deep down the field. Usually it's somewhere between 5 and 8, while the other wide receiver's job is to come directly underneath him in the cross, so that it's so close. The goal is that they're so close that they can actually slap hands. It's essentially a rub route. Now, why do they want to slap hands? Because the rub route basically makes it so if the defense is playing man, there's virtually no way, or it's almost impossible for the man coverage to stay with both crossing wide receivers in that.
It's a natural pick, in other words.
Natural pick, correct. And so now for the rest of the routes that are involved here, it kind of depends on who's running it, because there's many different versions of mesh in the NFL right now. We'll start with basically so the mesh is these 2 crossing routes coming over the middle of the field. That's actually not the primary read in the route. The Z wide receiver is the primary read, or an alert read, in both cases, depending on what he's doing. He's usually either running a deep post or a deep corner or a deep out route. So for the Giants, if you can imagine the Z wide receiver, we're talking about OBJ. And basically, it's kind of Manning's job to see what the coverage is and see if he likes that deep safety throw, which he honestly this year he may. And we're talking about a 15, 20-yard post route down the field. The second read usually is what the running back does, and this is where it gets really interesting, and kind of a big reason why I picked this this play to break down. The running back traditionally runs, in my opinion, runs a wheel route or a rail route, and so you're talking about, and most of the time this run out of shotgun, doesn't have to be, but the running back coming from the backfield, getting pressing horizontally, making that coverage, whether it's zone or man, usually a linebacker or a safety, come out wide and then going north. And with new running back Saquon Barkley running that route, it's going to be pretty devastating. And we know that we've seen that in practice. It's been talked about on Twitter, and guys like Dan have been all over it, where Barkley's flashing in this route, and that's usually the second read. And again, it could be the primary in some offenses. And so those 2 parts, those 2 dynamics actually are pretty deadly within the concept itself. And, many people would ask, okay, so what's kind of the point of the mesh? The mesh is almost like a visual distractor to zone players by these 2 players crossing the eye lines of the zone. And then in man, it's to provide the third read the third read for the quarterback, or sometimes the second read, which is one of those crossers to the strong side of the field is going to be open. I'm not going to say no matter what, it's very hard to defend that wide receiver at that point, especially if the quarterback rolls that way just a touch. So you see 3 good options. It is a full 5-player read. Like I said, the last route in this, or the last part of this, would be, oftentimes something over the middle after the 2 crossers go through the zone. So the Eagles, for example, in the Super Bowl, where they ran this a lot, I think it was over 9 times actually. Their other guy ran basically a sit route, which is a diagonal route going to the middle of the field, where he turns and sits in the wake of space created by the 2 crossers coming past each other. I think it's pretty devastating to really any coverage. Many guys make the point that against cover 2, it's a little difficult, because cover 2 is 2 on 2 over, and either 4 or 5 underneath defenders, and those guys are kind of right where the mesh is, and they're not going to be following or trailing the crossers. So cover 2, it's a little bit of a headache against cover 2, but I still think that sit route in cover 2 is very, very deadly. And against everything else, I think it's tough. Against man, I think it's tough. I think this is a route where I think if the defense knew it was coming, kind of like how teams did with the Eagles because they ran it so much in the playoffs, it's still difficult to stop even within that. And yeah, I think for the Giants this year, it's something that Pat Shurmur featured last year, and it's something that takes the best elements of where the Giants are right now. It's Ingram as a crosser because he'd be one of those crossing routes. It's Barkley as on the wheel route, and it's OBJ with the deep post. And you throw all that together, and I think it's hard to defend.
Right. And you think about all the different variations of this route. Like, so you can use Ingram as the crosser, Shepard as a crosser. You can use Ellison or Adams or whoever is in, or if they're going 3 receivers, Latimer to sit in that that stop route you talked about once it clears out. Or you can really use Ingram to sit in that zone if teams are playing the cover 2, like you said. But even when teams are dropping in cover 2, it's still going to be difficult to defend Saquon Barkley on the wheel route because we've seen it all throughout practice. Barkley's destroyed Olivier Vernon and Kareem Martin, the Giants' 2 outside linebackers. And against all these teams that play 3-4, it's going to be really difficult to contain Barkley on this wheel route. And then you also just talk about, teams used the cover 2 against the Giants an incredible amount last season, basically all game because they dared the Giants to run. Is that going to be so easy this season with Will Hernandez, Nate Solder, maybe John Halapio in the middle, Patrick Omame, an extra blocker in Ellison, and then Saquon Barkley in the run game? I don't think it's going to be as easy to just sit and drop and cover 2 like teams have in the past. So I'm not as worried, about the cover 2, kind of stymieing this route to say, or this route concept to say, but I'm very excited hearing about that because I saw it work all, not only with the Eagles, but with Pat Shurmur and the Vikings. This is something I constantly, even myself, notice, and I don't have the same kind of, game film advanced view of the game as you do, Nick. I'll be the first to admit that. But I saw, this is something I noted right away when the Giants first hired Shurmur. So it's something to be very excited about moving forward with this Giants offense. And did you want to touch on anything more with that, or should we get to the last aspect of the show?
The other side of it too, I think that's an interesting thing you bring up with guys playing 2 deep against Eli. Teams definitely, I've seen a few examples. Teams like to do that to Eli because you can kind of confuse him a little bit. Cover 2 deep can rotate into a lot of different coverages, and I don't mean to go on a tangent here, but
we love it.
But what's interesting is this year with Shurmur with so many predefined reads, I think that's going to take a lot of that away because he's going to have a pretty clear defined way of doing things pre-snap, kind of no matter what teams do at the snap. And that's where, you're simplifying things for your players and allowing them to play by hoping or allowing your players to get into space to make plays. It's different than kind of relying on 3 and 5 step drops, quick drops to beat teams to the punch almost, I guess is kind of a good way to summarize what McAdoo was doing. So it's interesting. I noted on film last year that 2 deep against Manning, he kind of was always a little uneasy. And, I think that this is something where, this doesn't match up great for mesh, but like we said, it's like there are other answers here that, are in the progression that he can find because he's going to be in a much different position.
Yeah. And Nick, definitely never cut yourself off again, because that was my favorite point you made on this whole podcast, because that's exactly what you were right about. McAdoo's whole concept of his offense was beat the team to the punch. And in that situation, if defense does a good job of disguising their coverage and making a quick change post snap, it could lead to an interception from Eli Manning, an errant pass, just because, that's the style of the offense. 3 and 5 step drops, get the ball out quick. 5 or 6 sometimes. Well, not 6. It was about 5 receivers running routes. That was the old McAdoo offense. He very rarely used an extra player in pass protection. He almost always used his running backs on pass routes and almost never, if ever, used max protection. And that's all going to change with Shurmur as well. Like you said, more defined reads, a different style of offense that really relies less on getting the ball out quick. And like you said, I like what you just said there, beating the defense to the punch, because that's not really a good style for moving an offense. We've seen, even the Packers offense struggle in Mike McCarthy's scheme with a guy like Aaron Rodgers at quarterback, and that's really never happened. So before we close out the show, I just wanted to give a little quick hot take on the Odell Beckham Jr. potential holdout. There's been one anonymous report suggesting Beckham could hold out in training camp, although Beckham himself said, I will not be holding out. Last offseason, after Beckham skipped voluntary, I repeat, voluntary OTAs, before returning for last season's minicamp, he said, I have no interest in ever holding out. I've seen it happen with players before, and it has very little to no progress. You don't gain anything by holding out. I'm not the type of player who will hold out. So I'm going to choose to believe Beckham's exact words rather than an anonymous report. I hope you guys do too. I don't see any chance of Beckham holding out. And, you think back to the last time this happened with the Giants, and that was the 2008 season after the 2007 Super Bowl, when Plaxico Burress wanted a new deal because he was set to make like $10 million over the next 3 years. These are old school NFL contracts back in 2008. Also, the Giants signed Plax like one of the greatest free agent bargains ever. That was still during a Corsi's run as general manager. Obviously Jerry Reese wouldn't be able to do it, as we've seen from some of his contracts. But Plax, didn't. There was different times. Plax basically rode the bike throughout the entire training camp after skipping minicamp and taking the fines. And then the Giants, just before the start of the season, kind of ripped up his deal and gave him a new one. So I wouldn't worry about it. The Giants are a team that tend to take care of their players. I think Beckham knows that. I think there's going to be some progress towards a contract that will eventually be signed before the start of the regular season. So I have no issue worrying about a holdout. Nick, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, a little, but I actually wrote a piece and Inside the Pylon, and my goal, this was maybe 3 or 4 months ago. My goal was to dig up the film for Giants fans that would kind of say, hey, like OBJ is a great player, but if he happens to get traded, it's okay because. And I went into that with that goal, and after watching his tape, it was, especially in the fit with Pat Shurmur's offense, it was so just hands down, like, of course this guy's going to want to be there, and of course Pat Shurmur is going to want him there. It was such kind of like it's just a really easy match for a guy like that, and it adds another element that Shurmur hasn't had. So for me, I was like, wait a second, I think these guys are going to kind of, no matter what, I think number one, he's going to, no matter what, he's going to be there, and number two, Shurmur's going to really want him there. Whether or not the business side works itself out longer term, I don't know, but this, from a schematic fit perspective, it's harder to find a better guy, a better receiver, to be honest. Excuse me. So, I think that's, I agree. I really tend to agree.
Yep. And that's going to be it today for the show, folks. I do appreciate you tuning in. I know Nick appreciates it as well. We've got another 4 weeks to go before training camp kicks off, or a little less than 4 weeks now. The rookies will actually report first on July 22nd. Rookies, quarterbacks, and a select group of veterans. And then on the 25th, everyone shows up. Training camp kicks off for the Giants. So we may or may not do a couple more of these before camp, maybe looking at some different position battles, any news that pops up if the Giants sign anybody. But until then, I do appreciate you guys following in. I'm going to sign off on that. Nick, do you have any parting words?
No, I kind of alluded earlier in the introduction. I actually was just picked up at cover1.net to write exclusively for the Giants, X's and O's. So that'll start basically this week pretty soon. My first topic is Darian Thompson. So I'll give the full breakdown there and the full film breakdown there, which will be fun, and basically looking to write as much as I can on the Giants there and kind of go from there. So still finding my work on there or on Twitter at TManic21, where I'm basically trying to spend most of my time focusing on Giant X's and O's. And excuse me, got a little bug in my throat. And besides that, looking forward to coming back and doing this again.
Yeah, no doubt, guys. And if you guys do want to see more of my work, you can find me on Twitter at Dan Schneier NFL. That's DANSCHNEIER NFL. Obviously, you can find all my work on GiantsAnd247sports.com. And then please, guys, if you do love the show, if you do enjoy it, this is episode 3, do us a favor. Go on iTunes, subscribe to the show, download all the shows you haven't previously listened to, listen to those, but just at least download them and give us a 5-star rating or any kind of rating and review. That will help us move up the algorithm. That'll help more people see the show, and that'll ultimately help grow the podcast. So thanks again for tuning in, guys. And on that note, we're going to go Giants.